Well, let's dive into electric vehicles and their grid impact, the last topic I wanted to address for the lecture. As we saw before, EV adoption is expected to increase, and as shown in the figures here, by 2040, we are expecting to see about 70 million EVs sold per year worldwide. And you can see that a significant focus is going to be on small and medium and SUV vehicles and a small amount of autonomous vehicles. Roughly by 2040, this corresponds to about 50% of all car sales are expected to be electric vehicles. And overall, in the free fleets, in many cities, more than 50% of all vehicles on the road will be electric. One reason why electric vehicles are becoming so central to the energy transformation is that electric vehicles are far more efficient. When you look from the conversion of the overall efficiency of the transformation of energy into motion, battery electric vehicles, have 73% overall efficiency. Hydrogen fuel cell vehicles have 22% efficiency, and then traditional vehicles, combustion engine vehicles, are only 13% efficient. In fact, there's this equivalency of the EVs and gas tanks of cars. An EV is 95% efficient versus a car is 30% efficient when just looking from the point where they're fueled in. But how do you actually refuel these EVs? Well, it's through charging. And charging is classified by both charging rate and location. You have level 1 charging or slow charging, that's up to 1.4 kilowatts. That basically is connecting your car to a wall outlet. It's a pretty slow process. You have the level 2 charging, which ranges from 8 to 19 kilowatts, and that already requires a more dedicated charger. Level 2 charging can be seen, at workplaces, at homes where you have a dedicated charger. That's going to be the rate. And then finally, you have a level 3 or DC fast chargers, which are all the speeds above 19 kilowatts. So charging, of course, impacts the battery of the vehicle. Depending on the speed in which you charge, it may cause a more or less degradation of the battery. But charging also impacts the grid. And managing this charging is a key challenge for the future when you think about deep penetration of electric vehicles. Let's look at what a typical charging profile looks like from a perspective of the state of charge, or meaning the total amount of energy stored in the vehicle. So you can see here that when the battery is empty and you start to charge, essentially you're going to charge at a maximum rate limited either by your charging equipment or by the battery itself for the first 2000 seconds, which is about 80% of the state of charge. So it can go from 0 to 80 pretty linearly, and this is what's called a constant current mode. This means that during this period of time, there is a constant amount of power flowing into the battery at the rate you selected. When we reach 80% state of charge, the battery system, management system in the car switches to what's called a constant voltage mode. And the reason it does that is that it now starts to modulate the amount of current that's flowing into the battery, and by monitoring the voltage to ensure that we don't overcharge the battery itself. And so you see a significant slowdown from that point onwards because of the change of the mode. So avoiding this overcharging, typically requires very accurate battery models. And this charging profile information impacts the grid demand itself. Now, DC fast charging, which is the fastest charging you can have, the charging speed is growing. So when you think about a typical car with a 100 kilowatt battery and you decide to charge it to 80%, if you're using your level 2 charging at 11 kilowatts, it's going to take about 7 hours. With the first generation of Tesla superchargers at 125 kilowatts, that took 38 minutes to charge 80% of the battery. With the more recent Tesla superchargers, and that is the 250 kilowatts, it takes 19 minutes. EVgo has started deploying stations that charge at 350 kilowatts, so that takes 14 minutes to charge this 100 kilowatt car to 80%. A Porsche that can be electric vehicle can be charged to 750 kilowatts, which would take just 6 minutes to charge. And more recently, Tesla announced that for their semi trucks, you can charge them at megawatt, which would mean 5 minutes for charging. And Mercedes announced that you could charge them at 3 megawatts for their trucks, which would mean just 2 minutes for charging a car of 100 kilowatts. So that is very, very fast charging. But as you can see, the amount of the demand in the grid has increased all the way from 19 kilowatts up to 3 megawatts. Just so that you have an idea of the order of magnitude of this, a typical home consumes peak 8 kilowatts. So even a level 2 charger is equivalent to turning on 2 full homes. And if you're talking about a EVgo station of 350 kilowatts, you're talking about something like 40, 50 homes being turned on all at once when you're trying to charge a car. How do we measure the impact of charging on the grid? At Stanford, we did a study to try to understand how such impact on the grid will happen when we have deep penetration of electric vehicles. The impact will depend on where and when people charge. And so we looked at various scenarios. The first one, we assumed that everyone could charge at home. And you can see the impact is that the peak of electricity consumption in the evening substantially increases. The next one is called high home, where we assume that some of that charging that happens at home could also happen at work or in a charging station. And that now rebalances the peak. So we have two peaks, one earlier in the day of what's being charged at workplace or at the charging station, and a smaller peak at the home in the evening. We also looked at a scenario where most people opt to charge at work or in the charging stations and not much at home. That's the third scenario. And you can see there is a substantial increase in the peak in the early hours of the day, but a substantial reduction in the later hours. And finally, we looked at a scenario where we had both low home and low work, and mostly people were charging on public stations, and that looks very similar to low home, high work. Now, it's interesting that the peak increases are different across these different scenarios, but also the timing of the peak is different. If you look at the WEC region grid, which is California, Oregon, Washington, we're going to see different amounts of increase in different hours, but the 2040 grid itself has a lot of renewables, which means peaks on earlier hours of the day between 8 and 4 are actually very good for the grid because you are consuming a lot of the excess solar generation, versus even smaller peaks but at later hours in the day are not so great because you're going to have to require some of those reserves and traditional generators to run to supply power for you, or at least you will require additional amount of storage to satisfy your loads. So even something as simple as encouraging people to charge at work and in public stations in the future will result on a net decrease in the cost of integration. When looking at this study, we also were able to figure out at what moment did charging become an issue for the grid. When you have small amounts of EVs, the impact of the grid is very small, so it's not really that important. And in the curves here, we show for the different scenarios the change in the total peak demand as we increase the adoption of EVs. And you can see that up to 30%, the change in the peak demand is very small. But once you go past that, we have a substantial increase in the peak demand and a substantial increase in the impact on the grid. So how do we mitigate the impacts of charging? We incentivize charging during times of high renewables. That's the first major mitigation strategy. Second, we can help consumers choose where to charge, workplace, home, or station. And third, we can use technologies such as PowerNet to coordinate charging with renewables. So that will substantially reduce the impact of charging on the grid and help the integration of renewable at the same time.